I am delighted to get to be with you. Some of my best friends are seminarians, so I'm glad to have a chance to be here. And I hope that what I have to say will be a suitable honor to Dr. Knight. Dean Williford has been uncommonly gracious to me in rearranging things to suit my particular wants of schedule. And Dr. Frampton has been a wonderful host to me. As we talked last night about my theme of why the Old Testament should not go away, we both agreed that the primary answer is that it guarantees us work. So we don't want it to go away. But I wanted to think about that question with you, why the Old Testament should not go away, with the recognition that in much of the practice of the church it has indeed gone away. So this is an advocacy that we need to pay more attention to it. Many answers could be given to that question, but the one I want to answer today is the Old Testament should not go away because it provides a script wherein we may think honestly and faithfully about economic questions. I have been studying economics in the Bible lately and have concluded that it is an urgent task for us in the church because our society lives in an enormous economic crisis and there's almost nobody left to think about it responsibly except the church. So I have three theses, and then I will unpack that a while. The first thesis is that the Bible, for the most part, originated in and is best read in an economy of extraction. By extraction, I mean procedures that allow powerful people to extract wealth from vulnerable people. The second thesis that I have is that the Bible offers a fairly sustained critique of an economy of extraction and consistently offers an alternative that is an evangelical option. And the third thesis is that we in the Western world and in the United States live in an economy of extraction. So I judge this to be a fairly pertinent thing for us to be talking about on the day before the election, because indeed much of the infamous campaign has really been about the economy of extraction and who does it better. So I have given you a bibliography of 5 titles that I think are fairly representative of the evidence that we do live in an economy of extraction, and therefore those of us who take the Bible seriously must learn better how to critique that economy of extraction and how to think seriously about an alternative. So I want to comment briefly on these 5 titles, and then I will go along to talk about some biblical texts to support the theses that I've just enumerated. The first title on the Empire of Cotton is a study of the worldwide history of cotton, and the thesis of the book is that wherever you find the production of cotton, you will find violence. And of course, the United States is a living example with our history of slavery, and what happened in the Old South is that the cotton mills of Liverpool and Manchester required more and more cotton, which caused the plantation economy to put more and more pressure on the slaves to produce more and more cotton, so that it became an increasingly brutal exercise. The second title is a very ambitious book that traces the fact that since the ancient Sumerians in 3000 BCE, the money managers have willfully kept vulnerable people in debt. Because if you can keep vulnerable people in debt, you make them dependent and you create a labor pool of cheap labor. Glauber is not a theologian, he's an economist, but he ends his book with an affirmation that the only way forward in a society like ours of enormous debt is the practice of jubilee and debt cancellation. He got that idea from the Old Testament. The Old Testament, in its alternative economic proposals, culminates in the Jubilee year, which there is some evidence that Jesus championed. The third title by James Risen. Risen is a journalist who has been on trial for not revealing his sources, but his argument in this book is that the moneyed class is committed to perpetual war, and the main political strategy for sustaining perpetual war is endless fear. And he makes the argument that whenever a political decision needs to be made to support the military, the threat of terrorism is ramped up so that people willingly commit to that. This is a huge issue for those in the church whose primary evangelical message is do not fear. The fourth title, which is loaded with statistics, is an argument that around the world the moneyed classes are expelling vulnerable people from their property, from their water rights, and from their chemical rights. And the author says that in the United States, the strategy of expulsion is mass incarceration. I don't know whether you've read the new book recently about racism in Forsyth County, Georgia. There's a review of that racism in which Forsyth County, which is not so far from Atlanta, expelled all blacks from the county, and if they didn't leave, they were killed. But reports that as black people left their small properties in Forsyth County, white people began to pay property tax with no claim. They paid property tax, and after you pay property tax for 7 years, you can own the property. That's expulsion, and it's everywhere. And the fifth title, which I found the most chilling, by alternate chapters, is an expose of how justice is practiced toward poor people and how justice is practiced toward powerful people. The justice toward poor people is done by police sweeps of poor people who are standing in front of their apartment who get arrested for blocking traffic, or are standing on the grass who get arrested because they could have been standing on the sidewalk. And what that does is create police records and cause people to lose work time and income. And the alternative chapters are a sustained observation that none of the money managers and the bankers and the hedge fund managers who caused the recession of 2008, not one of them has ever been indicted. And the author concludes that that's because Eric Holder, the Attorney General, has always been in bed with Wall Street. You can see all of these features working in the presidential campaign. So I offer to you these 5 titles, of which there could be many more, to make the case that we live in an economy of extraction, and those of us who have been entrusted with the Bible have an obligation to know about the economy of extraction in the Bible and in our culture, to know how to critique it and how to think seriously about a neighborly alternative. So the substance of what I want to say, probably this is all familiar to you, is to offer you 4 case studies in the Bible of extraction. And of course the principal case study is Pharaoh. Pharaoh may or may not have been a person, but what Pharaoh is a metaphor for an economy of extraction. And the evidence for that is in texts in Genesis that we likely will never read in church, because it is reported in Genesis 41 that Pharaoh had these two nightmares about scarcity. He dreamed about lean cows eating fat cows and lean bad stalks of wheat eating good stalks of wheat, and Joseph explains to him that he dreamed about running out of food. It's so ironic. You will find this in your ministry. It is so ironic that the people with the most have the greatest anxiety about running out and not having enough. It is a key truth of church stewardship. And in response to that crisis, the nightmare of scarcity, Joseph, his food czar, an Israelite who forgot he was an Israelite, institutes a policy of confiscation on behalf of Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh eventually has a food monopoly. And when the famine comes, the peasants who live on subsistence economy must come for food, and they buy food. And the second year when they come for food, they don't have any money, so he takes their cattle, Joseph does, and puts them out of production. And the third year when they come for food, it doesn't occur to him to give them food. They don't have any money, they don't have any cattle, they don't have any bartering capacity. He takes their land, and he takes their bodies, and he makes them debt slaves. So when we read the book of Exodus, we do not often ask, how did the children of Israel get into slavery? And the answer is, they got into slavery by an extractive economy that took away their cattle and their land and their means of production and their means of livelihood until they became dependent and became cheap labor for the oligarchy that was clustered around Pharaoh. The book of Exodus is not an historical memory. It is a map of social analysis. It is a map of social analysis for the oligarchy in which we live, that is busy extracting wealth from vulnerable people by tax and mortgage and interest and debt regulation and low wages, until the indebted labor class becomes completely helpless and hopeless. And whatever else Donald Trump may not have right, which I judge to be quite a bit, he has latched on to that sense in our society of people who are being left behind by the extraction economy. The Exodus narrative is a critical response to Pharaoh's extraction economy. And when you look at the Exodus narrative, what strikes me as most interesting is that God comes late to the Exodus narrative. God doesn't figure till the 3rd chapter of Exodus. Before that, there are surreptitious midwives who defy Pharaoh and birth Hebrew babies. There is the cry of distress by the Israelite slaves when one Pharaoh died before another one took over. And there is this confrontation in which Moses, in great indignation, finally commits an act of violence against the extractive economy by killing a Hebrew supervisor. This is all play, this is all drama, this is all liturgy. But it is beginning to mobilize a critique of Pharaoh's extraction economy that will eventuate in an alternative. So when they finally, after they do all the plagues and they play anything you can do, I can do better than you, turns out that Yahweh is stronger than Pharaoh's technicians. And they get to the water and they sing and dance free at last. Then two big episodes happen in the Exodus narrative. The first episode is that in Exodus 16, they have to go into the wilderness. Now, I think there are two factors to the wilderness in the wilderness as metaphor in the Bible. The first one is that the wilderness is territory that's beyond the reach of Pharaoh. Pharaoh does not govern there. And the second factor about the wilderness is that there are no viable life support systems in the wilderness. And the news of the narrative that if you want to leave the dead economy of Pharaoh, you got to go into the wilderness where Pharaoh cannot reach and where there are no viable life support systems. And then you know what happens in Exodus 16 and 17. The bread, the bread simply comes down. It is bread that cannot be explained in Pharaoh's categories. And the quail arrive, so they had meat. And Moses discovered that if you hit the right rock, you'll get water. And as you know about the bread, it says that everybody gathered what they needed. So it turns out in the imagination of this narrative that the wilderness turns out to be a place of abundance. This is the core claim of the gospel, that as long as we live in the extractive economy of Pharaoh, we will live in an economy of anxious scarcity. And whenever we have courage and freedom to imagine ourselves outside of Pharaoh's domain, we will discover that it is a zone of abundance where the Creator God governs. The other episode is that they move on to Sinai, where they get 10 anti-Pharaoh commandments. You could tell they're anti-Pharaoh because the first word is, I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I got rules for living outside of Pharaoh. So I entertain the thought that we have misread the 10 Commandments by taking them as coercive rules. What if they are guidelines for how to organize the economy differently? I will mention two. At the center is Sabbath. There is no Sabbath in Pharaoh's Egypt for anybody. 2 weeks ago I was at a wealthy Episcopal church in Charlotte, And I was talking about the Sabbath, and I said we ought to quit the NFL because it is a liturgy of sex and violence and money on Sabbath day. And the pastor began to push back against me because I found out that the owner of the Charlotte NFL team was in the congregation. But the associate pastor said, well, he probably needed to hear it. Have you noticed how busy people are? The extraction economy wants us to be endlessly busy, because busy people do not critically reflect. And the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, it's a little short commandment, but it uses the word neighbor 3 times. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife in a patriarchal society. You shall not grope. A lot's lost in translation. You shall not covet your neighbor's field. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. And the extractive economy covets everything for everybody. So the normative narrative of the Old Testament, Exodus, wilderness, Sinai, is a meditation on what it would be like to depart Pharaoh's extractive economy for the sake of an alternative. And I do not have to tell you, seminarians, that most church people do not even suspect that about the Bible. The second case study is Solomon. In Sunday school, we just learned that he's a temple builder and he's really smart. But that's because the people who write the Sunday school curriculum never read the Bible. If you read it all closely, what you can see is that Solomon is a big extractor. If you read, and I think Solomon's temple maybe served a purpose not unlike Trump Towers. It was a great exhibit of Solomon's wealth, because if you read those turgid chapters, 1 Kings 6 and 7, it's gold, 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 gold. And you wonder where he got all that gold. And then the narrative tells us where he got all the gold. He got all the gold by being an arms dealer. That's what he was, with horses and chariots passed north and south. He got all the gold by cheap labor, or the text says forced labor. One text says only foreigners had to do it. Another text said everybody had to participate in forced labor. He got all the gold by a very effective tax system. The text in 1 Kings 4 has almost not been studied because scholars have been too busy tracing where the geographical boundaries of the tax districts are, which is kind of interesting. But what has not been noticed, they had 12 tax districts because every tax district had to raise money for 1 month to support this lavish monarchy. What has not been noticed is that 2 of the tax districts had as their chairs Solomon's sons-in-law. It must have been very lucrative. So if you take arms dealing, cheap labor, and taxes, what you've got are 3 forms of extraction that reduce everybody outside of the oligarchy, or as scholars now say, the Jerusalem elite, to dependence and debt. The first response to this extraction is in 1 Kings 12 at Solomon's death, when King Rehoboam has to renegotiate tax arrangements with northern Israel. And he doesn't understand how politics works. He's the first guy that said, "I'm not a politician," like Donald Trump. He just wants to raise more taxes. So what you get is a tax revolt in which the northern kingdom say, "We're not going to pay those taxes." And it is reported that Rehoboam's tax officer was killed, and that Rehoboam had to get on his mule and flee for his life, because the peasants had come alive to their historical opportunity. But the real response to Solomon's extraction system is the prophetic movement, because Solomon's extraction system lasted in Jerusalem for 400 years. And what you get, according to that 400-year timeline, what you get from the prophets are these explosive poems that lay bare the abuse of the system and which consistently say that it is not sustainable. So Isaiah, Amos, Habakkuk say, "Woe to you." That means big trouble coming to you. And the reason this is so important to us is that we are now facing up to the first hints that our extraction system in the United States is no longer sustainable. Both Hillary and Donald want us to think they know the secret to sustain it, but in fact neither one of them does. So the prophetic movement is, over time, an incredible movement of social analysis and social critique that eventually morphs into social alternative. But I do not think that we have done a very good job of seeing that the prophetic movement is essentially aimed at the extraction system of the king and the scribes and the priests and the lawyers who had a monopoly on law-making that gave them economic privilege. The third case study that probably your Bible does not open to it is in Nehemiah. And what you likely know is that Nehemiah was appointed the governor of the colony of Judah or Judea by the Persians. So he was Persia's man, and the purpose of the Persian Empire was to collect taxes. That's the purpose of every empire, is to collect revenue. And the way it worked is that the Persian Empire hired local Jews to collect taxes from other Jews to send to Persia. And the way it worked is that if the local Jews could collect more taxes than got sent to Persia, they got to keep that. So it was very lucrative to be a Jewish tax collector collecting taxes from other Jews. And in Nehemiah 9, Ezra prays this long prayer. I think it's 37 verses. That's long in the Bible. It's a kind of a mingling of how disobedient we have been and how gracious God has been. That's kind of the story. It's a Deuteronomic story. But the last two verses of the prayer, I think it's verses 36 and 37, Ezra says in prayer, here we are, here we Jews are, here we are, slaves in our own land, And the produce of our good land that was supposed to go to us as the land of promise is now going to foreign kings, that's the Persians, who have taken our cattle and our land and who do what they please with our cattle and our land. And then the prayer ends this way: and we are in great distress. What strikes me about the prayer is that Ezra doesn't even utter a petition. He doesn't say help us, he doesn't say save us. He's too beat out. He can't even make an offer to God. We are in great distress from the extraction system. In Nehemiah 5, it is reported that poor Jews are having to mortgage their fields and sell their children to pay their taxes that go to the Persian system. And Nehemiah the governor, it says, when he heard about it, I don't know what took him so long to hear about it, he was very upset. The old translation said he took counsel with himself, which is the best way to have a committee.